Episode 13: The Difference Between Good Advice and Comfortable Advice. Hello, I'm Alexander von der Fellen, and this is the Next Gen Mentor podcast. This series is for you if you've grown up with family wealth always there in the background, sometimes helpful, sometimes confusing, and often not spoken about directly. And now that wealth is becoming something that you will soon have to relate to, and I'm here to help you prepare to do that. Last time, we spoke about how to work with advisors, what they actually do, how their motivations or incentives shape their perspective, and how to stay engaged without becoming dependent on them. Today, we take that again one step further. You see, once you begin to engage with advice, another question emerges quite naturally. And that is that not all advice is equal. Some of it is helpful, some technically correct, some feels right, and yet over time, not all of it leads you in the right direction. And that difference is not always obvious at the beginning.
I sometimes hear things that seem to make sense, but something feels wrong. How do I know what to trust?
That's a question that most people only begin to ask after they've already made a few decisions that didn't quite lead where they expected. You see, advice doesn't only operate at a technical level, it also operates at a psychological one as well. Some advice is challenging, it forces you to think, it introduces uncertainty, whereas other advice does exactly the opposite. It reassures, it simplifies, it confirms what you already suspect or hope to be true. And that second type is particularly dangerous because it is comfortable. There's a pattern that I've seen repeatedly across families and individuals in your position, and that is that when faced with complexity, most people don't look for the best advice. They look for the advice that reduces tension, advice that removes doubt, advice that aligns with existing expectations, advice that allows things to continue without disruption. It feels efficient, it feels cooperative, it feels right. But over time, it creates a little distortion because decisions are no longer shaped by what is most accurate. They are now shaped by what is most acceptable. You can probably recognize a parallel here with what we discussed in session 9, that decisions are rarely made purely on logic. They're shaped by influence, by relationships, and by what people are comfortable supporting. Advice works in exactly the same way.
What do you mean by comfortable advice exactly?
Comfortable advice is advice that fits easily into the existing system, doesn't challenge assumptions, it does not create friction, it does not require difficult conversations. It tends to sound reasonable, often even well argued, but it has one defining characteristic. It leaves everything largely unchanged. That's why it's accepted so easily, and that is also why it can be so misleading. Because the situations where advice matters most are usually the ones where something needs to change, where assumptions need to be questioned, where a different direction may be required. Comfortable advice rarely does that. So let me give you a simple example. Imagine a situation where an investment portfolio has been underperforming for some time. One advisor might say, oh, it's a temporary cycle, markets will recover, staying the course is sensible. Another might say, there may be structural issues here. We should re-examine the allocation and the underlying assumptions. You'll agree that the first feels easier. It avoids destruction. It aligns with the desire for stability. The second, on the other hand, introduces uncertainty. It may lead to difficult decisions. It may expose earlier mistakes. Both may be technically valid, but they lead in very different directions. And the difference between them is not just technical, it's behavioral.
So, should I just distrust anything that feels comfortable?
No, I think that would probably be too simplistic. Comfort is not the problem in itself. The problem is when comfort becomes the primary filter, when advice is accepted because it feels right, rather than because it has been properly examined. And this is where your role begins to change. You're no longer just receiving advice, you're evaluating it. To do that properly, you need to understand something else. Advice does not exist in isolation. It exists within a system. And as we discussed in session 3, systems have patterns. They have habits, they have preferences for how things are done. Advice that aligns with those patterns is obviously easier to accept. Advice that challenges them is obviously harder. This is not about right or wrong. It's about how systems behave.
Is that where consensus comes in?
Exactly. And this is where things become more subtle. Consensus is often seen as a positive outcome. It suggests alignment, after all, it suggests agreement, stability. But consensus can form in two very different ways. It can be the result of genuine agreement, different perspectives examined, challenged, and aligned. Or it can be the result of something else entirely, something more negative, people choosing not to challenge. Remember from session 9 that agreement does not always mean alignment. Sometimes it simply means that no one has pushed back. The same applies here. Consensus can reflect clarity, or it can reflect comfort, and distinguishing between the two is one of the most important skills that you can develop.
How do I tell the difference?
Well, you look at how the consensus was formed. Was there real discussion? Were different perspectives explored? Were assumptions questioned? Or did the conversation just move quickly towards agreement? Did certain points remain unexamined? Did some people remain silent? These are small signals, I grant you, but they tell you a great deal. Real agreement tends to feel different. It can take longer. It can involve some tension. It may require people to adjust their views. Comfortable consensus tends to feel smooth, almost too smooth. This is where independent judgment begins to matter. Up to now, much of what you have been doing is understanding the system, observing how decisions are made, learning how to engage. Now something else is required. You need to begin forming your own view in order to ensure that you're not simply carried away by the direction of the group. It's not easy. Independent judgment introduces a certain kind of friction internally at first inside you. You may feel uncertain. You may not yet have complete information. You may question whether your view is in fact valid. And externally as well, your perspective may not align with the group. It may slow the discussion. It may require others to reconsider. And this is where many people in your situation could hesitate. They default back to comfort, to consensus, to align, because it's easier. I think there's a parallel here with episode 6. When you begin to build your own path, the challenge is not deciding what to do, it's deciding when to follow what exists and when to step away from it. The same applies here. Advice presents you with direction, consensus reinforces it. But your role is not just to follow direction, it's to understand it, and when necessary, to question it.
What if I'm wrong?
Oh, believe me, you will be. At times, that's part of the process. Independent judgment is not about always being right. It's about engaging properly, listening, understanding, thinking, and only then forming a view. Sometimes that view will align with others, sometimes it will not. The important part is how you arrive at it. There's also something else to understand. Challenging does not mean opposing. This is where many people get it wrong. They think that to contribute independently, they need to push back, to disagree, to assert. In reality, that's not really effective, particularly in systems where relationships matter. Constructive challenge, however, works differently. It doesn't block the process, it refines it. And it usually begins with questions, clarifying ones. Remember in session 12 that the most effective way to engage with advisors is to ask precise questions that improve understanding. The same principle applies here. Instead of saying, I don't agree with this, you might ask, what assumptions are we making? Or what would need to be true for this to work? Or what are we not considering? These questions do something else. They do something important. They don't create resistance. They create space. Space for the decision to be examined more clearly. Over time, this changes your role. You're now no longer reacting to advice. You're shaping how it is used. You're not following consensus. You're now contributing to how it is formed. And that is a very different position. There's also a timing element to this. As we discussed in session 10, when you contribute matters as much as what you say. If you challenge too early, you may not yet understand the situation fully. If you challenge too late, the direction may already be set. So part of this is learning to read the moment. Is the discussion still open, or has it already converged? And that judgment takes time to develop.
What happens if I don't challenge at all?
Then something else tends to happen. You remain aligned, you remain cooperative, you remain easy to work with. But over time, your contribution becomes limited. You are present, but not shaping outcomes. And gradually, others begin to assume that you will follow rather than lead, because you haven't demonstrated independent judgment. This connects directly to session 5. Respect is built through behavior, not through position. It can't be inherited. And one of the behaviors that builds it is the ability to engage thoughtfully, to contribute when it matters, to challenge when necessary, not frequently, but precisely. There's also a risk in the opposite direction, challenging too often or without sufficient understanding. This tends to create friction, it reduces trust, and it can isolate you. So again, the balance matters. Not passive acceptance, not constant opposition, deliberate engagement. Over time, you'll begin to notice something. Good advice often does not feel immediately comfortable. It may require you to reconsider, to adjust, to think more carefully. Comfortable advice tends to feel easier at the beginning, but more difficult later. Good advice often feels the opposite, more demanding at the start, but more stable over time. And this is where the distinction becomes clearer. You're not looking for advice that feels right. You're looking for advice that holds up under scrutiny over time and across different perspectives. And that requires effort. But it's the difference between being guided by the system and operating within it. There is one final point to consider at this stage. Advice, consensus, and judgment are not separate. They interact. Advice shapes how situations are seen, consensus shapes how decisions are accepted, and judgment shapes how both are used. And your role, gradually I grant you, is to bring those three together deliberately. At the beginning, this may feel slow. You may feel that you're asking far too many questions, that you're holding things up. But over time, something changes. The quality of decisions improves. Your confidence becomes more grounded and your role becomes more defined. Not because you speak more, but because you understand more. And as that begins to take shape, something else will become visible. You'll begin to see that advice is not only something you receive, it's something that is shaped around you.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that.
Okay, let me try and explain it more simply. The way you engage with advice changes the quality of advice you receive. If you're passive, advisors simplify things for you. They present conclusions, they remove complexity, they reduce any kind of uncertainty. If you're reactive, they become defensive, they justify, they protect their position, they focus on being right. But if you are engaged, something different happens altogether. They begin to think with you, they explain more fully, they explore alternatives, they test assumptions alongside you, and over time the advice itself improves. So, this is one of the less obvious dynamics in systems like yours. Advice is not static, it responds, it adjusts to the level of engagement that it meets. And that means that your behavior does not just affect your understanding, it affects the quality of input that you receive. Remember from session 12 that advisors are not neutral? They bring perspective, incentives, and interpretation into every single situation. What is less obvious is that they also adapt. They observe how you respond, what you ask, what you ignore, and gradually, without discussion, they adjust how they communicate with you. So if you accept things easily, they simplify. If you question precisely, they deepen. If you engage consistently, they collaborate. This is where the difference between good advice and comfortable advice becomes more practical. Comfortable advice often appears when the system senses that you're not going to challenge it. Good advice appears when there is space for it, and that space is created by how you engage. There is another layer to this. Advice is rarely delivered in isolation. It's delivered in a context, a meeting, a conversation, a process that already has momentum. And that context influences how advice is shaped. Think back to what we were discussing in session 9. Decisions are often moving in a certain direction before they are formally discussed. Advice often follows that direction because advisors are responding to what they perceive as the likely path. They align with it, they support it, they frame their input in a way that will fit. And this is where something subtle can happen. Advice begins to reinforce momentum.
Does that mean advice can become part of the problem?
Exactly. In certain situations, and because it is aligned too quickly. When advice aligns with momentum without properly testing it, it just strengthens direction without necessarily improving it. And over time, that can lead to decisions that feel well supported, but are not well examined. This is why independent judgment matters so much, as a way of slowing things down just enough to ensure that direction is being chosen, not simply followed. You'll begin to notice moments where things seem to move easily. Agreement forms quickly, advice aligns neatly. The discussion feels, well, efficient. These moments are not necessarily wrong, but they are worth paying attention to because ease can sometimes signal alignment and sometimes signal avoidance.
What should I do in those moments?
You don't need to disrupt the process, but you do need to engage with it. A simple question could be enough. Are we all seeing this the same way? What would need to happen for this to go wrong? Is there an alternative we haven't explored? They're not challenges, they're invitations, invitations to examine the decision more fully. And over time, you'll begin to shift the standard of the conversation and you introduce a level of clarity that was not always there. This also connects directly to what we discussed in session 10. Governance in practice is about clarity, how decisions are made, on what basis, with what level of understanding. By engaging in this way, you're not just improving individual decisions, you're improving the whole process itself. There's also a personal dimension to this, because distinguishing between good advice and comfortable advice requires something from you, and that is a willingness to sit with uncertainty. Comfortable advice removes uncertainty. Good advice often introduces it. It may show that there is no simple answer, that trade offs exist, that different outcomes are possible, and that can feel uncomfortable, particularly at the beginning. You may find yourself wanting resolution, a clear answer, a direction that feels certain. That is a natural response, but it can lead you back towards comfortable advice because it's the quickest way to reduce tension. Independent judgment, however, requires a different approach. It requires staying with the complexity long enough to understand it, long enough to form a view that's not simply inherited from others. This is where maturity begins to show in how you deal with not knowing. Remember from session 8 that risk is not just about outcomes, it's about how you relate to uncertainty. And the same applies here. Advice is not just about answers, it's about how you engage with uncertainty. And there is also something else that begins to emerge, and that is a sensitivity to framing.
You mean the same situation being presented in different ways?
Yes, and that matters more than most people realize. Advice is always framed. The same set of facts can lead to completely different conclusions depending on how they are presented. You saw this in session 12. Advisors don't just present information, they interpret it, they emphasize certain aspects, they prioritize certain outcomes, and that framing influences how you perceive the situation. Let's give you an example. One advisor might say, this structure protects assets effectively, and another might say, this structure limits flexibility. Both could be true, but each highlights a different aspect, and depending on which framing you focus on, your decision may shift. This is why it's important to look beyond the conclusion to understand how it was reached, what assumptions sit behind it, what is being emphasized, and what is not. Over time, you'll begin to notice patterns. Certain advisors consistently frame situations in a particular way. Certain types of advice tend to align with certain outcomes. Certain arguments appear more frequently in certain contexts. And it's not something that needs to be resisted, but it is something to understand. Because once you see it clearly, you're no longer influenced by it unconsciously. You can weigh it properly. There's also the question of motivation and incentives. We touched on this before, but it becomes more relevant here. Advice is shaped not only by perspective, but also by what people are responsible for. A lawyer will tend to prioritize protection. An investment manager will tend to focus on returns. A trustee will tend to emphasize preservation. And none of these are wrong, but none of them are complete. And if you accept advice without recognizing its underlying incentives, you may mistake a partial view for a complete one. And this is where your role becomes integrative. You're not there to replace advisors. You're there to bring their perspectives together, to see how they interact, to understand where they align and where they do not. This is not something that happens immediately. It develops over time through repeated exposure, through observation, through engagement. And gradually something shifts. You begin to see advice not as answers, but as inputs, pieces of a larger picture. And at that point, the decision between good advice and comfortable advice becomes clearer. Good advice contributes to understanding. Comfortable advice reduces it. There's also a behavioral signal that you can use. Good advice tends to withstand questioning. Comfortable advice often weakens under it. All you need to do is ask a few simple questions, and the reasoning becomes clearer, deeper, more robust. And that is usually a good sign. If the reasoning becomes vague, defensive, or circular, that is worth noting. It doesn't mean the advice is wrong, but it may not be as solid as it initially appeared. There's also another dynamic that's worth recognizing, and it connects back to consensus. In group settings, advice often becomes collective. Different inputs are brought together, a direction forms, and over time that direction becomes reinforced. This can create a sense of certainty, a feeling that the decision is well supported, but that support may be based on alignment, not examination. Remember session 11. Systems can drift when assumptions are not revisited, when decisions are made based on continuity rather than clarity. Comfortable advice often supports that continuity. Good advice tends to question it.
So I should always challenge if I can?
Constructive challenge is essential to ensure that the group is thinking clearly. There's a simple way to think about this. Your role is not to create disagreement, it's to improve the quality of agreement. And that is a very different objective. It means that when you challenge, you do so to clarify, to deepen understanding, to ensure that the decision holds. Over time, this changes how you are perceived by the group. You're not seen as difficult or disruptive. You're simply seen as thoughtful, as someone who improves decisions, and that in turn changes how others engage with you. They begin to anticipate your questions. They prepare more carefully. They explain more clearly. And this is how the whole standard rises, not through instruction, but through behavior. There's also a longer term effect. As you develop this way of operating, your own judgment becomes more reliable because you process it differently. You're less influenced by how things feel, more focused on how they hold, less drawn to what is easy, more attentive to what is accurate. And that is where real confidence begins to form from clarity. Because over time you begin to trust your own process consistently. This brings us back to the central idea. The difference between good advice and comfortable advice is not always visible at the beginning, but it becomes visible over time through outcomes, through patterns, through how decisions unfold. And your role is not to identify it perfectly from the start. That's not realistic. Your role is to engage in a way that allows that difference to emerge by asking, observing, forming a view, challenging constructively. Do that consistently, and something will change. You're no longer just part of the system, you are helping it think. In summary, you'll receive a great deal of advice over time. Some of it will be excellent, some of it will be reasonable, and some of it will feel right in the moment, perhaps, but lead you in the wrong direction. Your task is not to reject advice, it's to work with it properly, not to look for certainty, but to look for clarity. And the difference between good advice and comfortable advice is rarely obvious at the beginning. It reveals itself through how well it holds when examined, when challenged, and when tested over time. And your role in that process matters a lot more than you might think. So here are some key takeaways, things to do. Stay engaged, even when advice sounds convincing. Ask simple, clarifying questions to test assumptions. Listen for how conclusions are reached, not just what they are. Form your own view, even if it's not yet fully developed. Challenge constructively to improve the quality of decisions. And things to avoid. Avoid accepting advice simply because it feels comfortable. Avoid confusing consensus with true agreement. Avoid deferring too quickly to confidence or authority. Try not to avoid questions in order to appear knowledgeable. Avoid reacting instead of engaging thoughtfully. And in the next session, we'll start looking at the human side of the system. And this is where things often become fragile. Not because of money, but because of people. We'll start with family conflict and how it is rarely about the money. It's almost always about control, identity, and fear. Until then, I am Alexander von der Ven.